Okay, we're going to talk about glucocorticoids today. Um, so some of the things that we're going to take a look at are the stimulus, where it's secreted from, what its target is, what that response of that target is, as well as the class. And on this one, we're actually going to talk about two disorders, hypo and hypersecretion. So we are going to include disorders on this one. Just to remind you guys kind of the structure of the adrenal glands. So glucocorticoids are actually a class of corticosteroids. So corticosteroids is like your umbrella term, right? And glucocorticoids is a type of that. So this can even be broken down a little bit. Now, glucocorticoids, they are produced in the adrenal cortex. But again, this, and we may not have talked about this before, but I will let you know now, the cortex is divided into three sections. So it's not just the cortex. It would be nice if it was. But we've got the zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. Now, the glucocorticoids, which we're going to be talking about today, is a part of the adrenal cortex known as the zona fasciculata. The primary glucocorticoid that we're going to talk about is cortisol. This could also go by other names. You may have heard it as cortisone or corticosteroid. On your test, we're going to call it cortisol, though, okay, on your test. So again, like I said a second ago, corticosteroids is that umbrella term that encompasses several different things, such as glucocorticoids, which comes from the zona fasciculata of the adrenal cortex, which will produce cortisol. Now, that's the path we're going to talk about today. The other class of corticosteroids are mineralocorticoids. These are produced from the zona glomerulosa of the adrenal cortex, and that is your primary mineralocorticoid would be aldosterone, and we'll talk about that on a different day. Just showing you some corticosteroids, the glucocorticoids versus the mineralocorticoids, and some terms that you may have heard, prednisone, hydrocortisone, cortisone. These are just some everyday terms that you've probably heard before. So what is the stimulus for the secretion of cortisol? What's the ultimate stimulus? Stress and long-term stress. This is secreted under long-term stress conditions. So how that pathway goes is the long-term stress is detected. The hypothalamus secretes CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone goes to the anterior pituitary. So I know on this diagram here it just says pituitary, but it should say anterior pituitary. That anterior pituitary, when CRH arrives, it secretes ACTH, adrenocorticotropin hormone, which then targets the adrenal cortex, specifically the zona fasciculata, where cortisol is going to be secreted. And this is that axis, that HPA axis, hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis. So the domino effect, so to speak, of how cortisol ends up getting secreted. So again, the hypothalamus secretes corticotropin releasing hormone. The presence of corticotropin releasing hormone in the anterior pituitary secretes ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. And the presence of that at the adrenal cortex, the zona fasciculata of the adrenal cortex secretes cortisol. And again, the negative feedback of that is when cortisol shows up, it prevents ACTH from being secreted from the anterior pituitary and prevents corticotropin releasing hormone from being secreted from the hypothalamus. So that's that negative feedback part of it. Again, just kind of showing the same thing. The difference with this is I wanted to show you that what does cortisol do? It affects your metabolic processes, which means we've got cellular respiration involved. We've got glucose involved in this. So what are the target cells and the target response? Well, there's several target cells. So we're going to have to kind of look at these each individually. That's why you've got the table here. So cortisol affects the immune system, and it actually suppresses the immune system. So when you've got high levels of cortisol in your body, your immune system isn't going to work well, so you're going to be sick more often, okay? Because your immune system isn't functioning properly. how does it affect the liver? Bottom line with these three components over here, we are increasing blood glucose. Okay, that's the bottom line. That's what's really happening in these three separate pieces, liver, muscle cells, and adiposes. We're trying to get glucose back into the blood because that's what cortisol does. So the liver is going to undergo gluconeogenesis, which means, hey, we're going to make glucose from things such as things you wouldn't suspect, right? Such as lactate, pyruvate, amino acids. So we're going to take things other than glucose and make glucose from it. So you can get glucose from just about, your liver has the ability to make glucose from just about anything. Well, not just about anything, but quite a few different food products. And then we're also going to, in the liver, undergo glycogenolysis, which means we're going to take a glycogen molecule and break it down into glucose. So again, we're making glucose. So the whole bottom line of the liver is to increase glucose. And that's what all of these three pieces are doing. Now, muscle cells, they're going to actually break down protein. And that protein will end up, and I'll show you in a minute, end up going in, and guess what? We're going to end up making glucose out of it. So it's called proteolysis when we take a protein and break it down into its component parts, such as amino acids. That's called proteolysis. It's protein catabolism. Remember, catabolism is to break things down. And then in the adipose tissue, we have lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fat into its component parts, which is glycerol and fatty acids. And again, the amino acids and the glycerol can feed back in, and guess what we're going to make? Glucose again. So the underlying theme for all of this, with the exception of the immune system, right? It just suppresses the immune system. All the other parts are adding blood glucose. They're adding glucose to the blood. They're breaking down and making and providing the building blocks for glucose. So just reminding you guys about cellular respiration. It takes glucose and ends up making ATP out of it. This occurs in the mitochondria. Now, the three main steps, or I guess four, you would have glycolysis, pyruvate, going to acetyl-CoA, and then you've got your Krebs cycle, also known as the citric acid cycle, and you've got your electron transport chain, also known as oxidative phosphorylation. That's just the way talking about the phosphate groups is what that's happening there. To make ATP. So we're taking the phosphate and adding it to a molecule to make ATP. And this is the overall equation, in case you guys forgot what that overall equation looks like. So we start with glucose. Now, we said previously that the whole purpose of cortisol is to get the building blocks available to make glucose, because you can take the glycerol from the fats and the sugars from the carbohydrates and dump it in during the glycolysis phase, and you will end up with ATP. It can enter the cycle here. Amino acids can enter the cycle in many different areas. Again, because through proteolysis, we've broken down those proteins and made amino acids out of them, and they can enter the cellular respiration cycle in many locations, ultimately making ATP. And then you also have your fatty acids here, because remember, the fats were broken down into glycerol and fatty acids. The fatty acids can enter the cycle as well. So I'm not asking you to memorize where all these things enter the cycle to end up making ATP. The point was that all of these building blocks have the ability to end up making ATP in the end. So in a long-term stress situation, we're trying to provide glucose or building blocks so that we can ultimately make ATP out of that. Now, what ends up happening is you really don't end up making ATP, you just have a lot of glucose in the blood. Now, the glucose produced by the liver during fasting conditions. When you're fasting, meaning you don't have a lot of sugar in the blood, the pancreas secretes glucagon. Now, glucagon has several different effects. It's going to send that to the fat cells, and the fat cells are going to break that down through a process known as lipolysis, which is what we just talked about. And then it's also going to go to the liver. And then we're also going to have the pancreas, which again secreted the glucagon, which means we have a lower amount of insulin, is going to take that muscle cell and break it down, which is what proteolysis is called, into the amino acid parts. And those amino acids are going to go to the liver. So ultimately, we're converting all of this stuff to glucose, which we termed a minute ago as gluconeogenesis. So when you take things other than glucose, you can make glucose out of stuff, and that process is called gluconeogenesis. We also have in the liver glycogenolysis, where we take this glycogen molecule right here and break it down into glucose, dumping the glucose into the blood. So the bottom line is we are increasing blood glucose levels dramatically during all of this cortisol. So just showing you lipolysis is all this is. So we've got a fat cell, we've got an adipocyte. Remember, triglycerides is the storage form of fat in the adipocyte. We're going to take that triglyceride, we're going to break it down into its building blocks. We're going to get glycerol, and we're going to get some free fatty acids. And that will, again, be able to be converted into glucose, which will, again, be able to go through and make ATP. So what is the overall result here? So if you guys haven't caught what I've been saying up till this point, it's an increase in blood sugar. I don't care which way you look at it. Cortisol is going to increase blood sugar. That's its job. Now, it also counteracts insulin in the pancreas, which means any insulin that is going to be produced, it's counteracting it. So remember what insulin does? Insulin shows up when you've got too much blood sugar. Well, cortisol is preventing that from working. So your insulin isn't able to get rid of the blood sugar. So again, your blood sugar builds up. Cortisol also reduces bone formation. So we'll see what that leads to here in just a second. It is a steroid hormone. It kind of sounds like a steroid hormone, right? Cortisol kind of sounds like a steroid hormone. So it is got that 4-ring structure that we're familiar with anytime we talk about steroids. Now, disorders, 2 of them. We're going to talk about hypersecretion of cortisol, which is also known as Cushing's disease, and we'll talk about hyposecretion in the next slide. So what are some characteristics of Cushing's disease, of a person that would have Cushing's disease? Too much cortisol. They end up having what's called a buffalo hump. This isn't visible in the picture here, but it's fatty tissue that exists between the shoulders, and it's sometimes referred to as buffalo hump. It's also going to have a person that has like a moon-shaped face called moon face, rounded face, some purple, pink stretch marks. Again, if you notice, there's some weight gain here. It is going to cause internally, you've got an increase in blood pressure. It's going to cause bone loss. You can kind of see the osteoporosis going on here in the broken foot, and type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes. Next, hyposecretion is called Addison's disease. Addison's disease. Now, this is not as common. This is fairly rare. It's usually an immune disorder at work when you have hyposecretion, too little secretion of cortisol. Extreme weight loss, low blood pressure, low blood sugar, usually decreased aldosterone. For now, just memorize that. We'll talk more about aldosterone probably in a different one. So the hyposecretion is the opposite as far as the weight goes and the blood pressure and the blood sugar to Cushing's disease. Okay, so that is it for this one.